All right. Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Benjamin Hadfield. I'm a technical dive instructor, a master instructor, as well as a specialty instructor for all things altitude diving. Plus, I dive a lot of altitude. So we'll be going through altitude diving class this evening. My qualifications to teach this is not only am I an instructor, but I spend a lot of time diving high altitudes from 8,500 feet on down. Now, we do have some in our class that actually dives higher than that. So it'll be interesting to bring that into the class as well. For this evening, just to confirm, we are recording this and it will be put out as well. Tom, Caleb, Brian, thank you guys for joining us.
Good to be here.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right. I will also be joined by my fantastic and multi-talented and far better than I deserve partner in the background. And if I say something wrong, she reaches up and she'll swat me in the back of the head. It's kind of fun.
You're a little far away.
I'm a little far away here. Let me get closer. There we go. I'm sure she has something she'll throw. Hopefully not the brass bowl. All right. Well, today we're going to be talking about altitude diving. We're going to be going through all the key pieces of this as well. As you might notice throughout the different processes in this presentation, there are lots of photos. I like putting photos of actual places that I've dove. I'll just give you an idea of the photo right here. That's me in side mount, taken by a National Geographic photographer. It's pretty proud of that. That is Yellowstone Lake, which sits at about 7,600 foot elevation. And that's the famous spires that we talk so much about. This is Nikki and I getting ready to go over and do those dives, and our camper in the background, and how we do a lot of these high altitude dives. And this is a beautiful lake in McCall as well. So there's lots and lots of really great opportunities, and the visibility can be anywhere from, we've dove high elevation lakes that had 100 feet of viz all the way down to this last weekend when I was diving the river. I had a wonderful, spectacular 5 feet of viz. It was amazing with current and temperatures between 31 and 34 degrees. So it was pretty fun. To become a certified and comfortable in diving, what we talk about is we're going to develop proper knowledge. I'm going to help you develop some skills. We're going to talk about the proper equipment and proper experience. For me, the experience is twofold, guys. First, I want to help give you the experience that you're able to do this safely, as well as give you a good experience while you're learning, make this a lot of fun as well. So I popped in a nice little video. This is Bear Lake over Memorial Day. Let's see. Potentially it's Bear Lake. Let's see. Well, it's being annoying here. Take me a second here. Let's see. Come. Why can't I minimize my screen? I guess. Close that. I'm trying to minimize my screen, but apparently it's not letting me minimize my screen. So we'll just have to exit full screen. There we go. All right. Minimize that. We'll try playing that again to give you an idea of some fun high altitude diving that is available to you guys. Let's see. Remove. Let's see. Stop screen share. Screen share. All right. Apparently, Bear Lake is not going to play here for us. And I don't know why. Why is it not? It should play. Your channel, your videos. Let's see. I apologize. Usually this kind of stuff just works out really, really well. But apparently this chance it doesn't want to. Here we go. Here we go. All right. Share screen. Entire screen. There you go. Can you guys see that now?
Yes.
All
Yep,
right.
got something loading.
I'll turn the sound off because the sound is not important. But this is Bear Lake. This is a nice little 6,800 foot elevation dive, and you can see that nice, clear, pretty water. The great thing about this dive is it's pretty easy to get to, other than walking across the rocks and being careful that you don't break your ankle. There's my blushing bride in the water just down from us, but you can see very clearly. Definitely some interesting opportunities. Now, one of the things to be aware of in most high elevation lakes is the fact that you're not going to get as many big, colorful, pretty fish as you might get in something like like the ocean. But you can see there's some nice visibility there. I did that purposely. But you'll also get a lot colder water as well. So that's a good opportunity. By the way, they call this the Caribbean of the Caribbean. So one of the things that you can plan on seeing, and when you start doing high elevation dives, is lots of rocks. So if you're into geology, you're going to see a lot of cool things, and you'll definitely see this weekend the dives we saw a lot of sculpin, a lot of big sucker fish that were very curious and very interested in what we were doing and seeing. There's my blushing bride doing some video of me as well. But this is pretty typical. You're going to see a lot of green. You're going to see a lot of rocks, a lot of fishing lures, and a fair amount of fish and crawdads as well. So we like Bear Lake for its geological features. It's all a lot of limestone in there, and you get a lot of dripping limestone. So it's definitely something that's interesting to see, and we definitely enjoy it. The visibility is not too bad. Bear Lake, you usually get 30 to 40 feet of viz. There's me diving as well, but you get an opportunity to see things that are definitely different than the ocean as well. So give you a quick idea of what you might see in a lake and what kind of visibility should be able to expect as well. Let's see, we'll just close out of that. Go back over to this. I apologize for the technical error about that. So diving in altitude, our objective today is because the reduced atmospheric pressure dives conducted at altitude require more decompression than identical dives conducted at sea level. And the standard dive tables can't be used as written. So throughout this class, we're going to learn several alternative approaches to determining safe diving practices for diving at altitude, as well as additional safe diving practices for emergency procedures. By the way, that was me for this past weekend. The water temperature at the surface there is like 32, 31 degrees. So I added an FFM and a spare hood. We're definitely going to talk about equipment as well.
Is that the river?
Yep, that is John's Hole Bridge.
Nice.
So, yeah, nice fun dive. Definitely interesting as well. So discussion, what does altitude mean to you guys?
It means diving at Ryrie.
Diving at Ryrie is an altitude dive. Tom, what do you think what does diving at altitude mean to you?
Yeah, not at sea level, 1,000 feet or above.
1,000 feet or above is the exact definition. How about you, Brian? I think pretty much all your diving's been at altitude, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
There you go.
Yep. So kind of like they said, just anything above 1,000 feet, and really sounds like more, I guess, lake diving than anything else. I can't really think of any saltwater diving you'd get at altitude, unless there's a high saltwater lake, but I don't know of any.
Very impractical thing to see. So you're going to get a lot of high altitude freshwater dives, right? And so the majority of your dives that we're going to be talking about are going to be dives between 1,000 feet and 10,000 feet as the dive tables are written. Now, the majority of the information we're going to be discussing this evening and talking about comes from the Navy. And God bless the Navy. They have their own ways of doing things, and most of their stuff comes from actual guinea pig experiments as well on actual divers that they went out and tried to get bent. Now, their dive tables are designed and information that everybody bases their information on or that we're using is off of revision 7.1 of the Navy dive standards as well, that talks about diving between 1,000 and 10,000 feet. Now, they do refer to very clearly that anything over 10,000 foot in elevation is to refer back to an additional attachment to the Navy dive tables. Now, unfortunately, they never actually published the attachment for 10,000 feet and above. It's been written, my understanding, but I have not met anybody within the dive field that can say, hey, I've read the dive standards for above 10,000 feet. So what the difference is there or not is certainly a mystery to me as well as you. So we're going to talk about 1,000 to 10,000 feet. Anything above 10,000 feet, we're not certifying for, but as long as we had added additional safety margins, we should be okay. So the main page we're going to discuss today, we're going to define some of the definitions and benefits of altitude diving. We're going to do a little Boyle's Law review. as well as we're going to talk about dive planning. We're going to learn some new terms, sea level equivalent depths and calculations, or SLED. We're going to learn how to calculate those. And I've got a couple different ways where I've gone through, and I've got some easy math for you. I've got complicated math and I've got easy math. So I'll show you the complicated math and then I'll show you the easy math if you don't mind. So does anybody not want to see the easy math? You just want to do all the completely hardest way you possibly can?
Let's spend as much time as possible on the easy math first.
I'm going to show you the hard math, though. We're going to talk about adjusting ascents and safety stops. I definitely want to get into thermal protection because, as we all know, I think Tom's got a really good feeling of this as well, is that thermal protection is reasonably important at a high altitude dive. We're going to talk about pre-dive checks and preparation. I really want to get into a little bit of air delivery systems, typical conditions in lakes and rivers. As always, we need to get into a little bit of emergency procedures, if not a lot of emergency procedures, common altitude dive maladies and prevention. And then finally, I'd like to make sure we discuss after the dive travel. How does that look? What does that look? And one of the reasons you might think about, for example, if you're diving the crater, if you get out of the water, put your crap in your car and immediately drive in any direction, you're going to have ascent of at least 1,500 to 2,000 feet of elevation ascent once you leave the crater. So it might be reasonably important to put a thought process on that. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about insurance. Dan is a great insurer. They're very generous with what they do, and they're the most inexpensive of all the dive insurances out there. And Dan, dive accident insurance is an affordable way for divers to obtain insurance against the cost of dive injuries that are often left uncovered by typical health insurance. Now, it covers diving and non-diving and named water sport accidents and injuries, pays 100% of an eligible accident medical expenses up to $500,000, and is available for divers age 70 and over. So if you guys are 70 or over in the U.S. or Canada, you're good to go here as well. Plans recognized worldwide in its annual coverage. So it's pretty inexpensive. I think Nikki and I pay about $400 a year for Dan coverage. So my question is always, will Dan cover insurance if you have a dive accident outside of your certification? So if you're not certified to jump sharks in a pool on a motorcycle, and you jump sharks on a pool over a pool in a motorcycle, 5 points for anybody that can name the TV reference on that, by the way. Do you think they'll cover you? Probably not. Now, while I don't have proof of that, Dan tends to be very liberal on that. It's definitely a good idea to always dive within your training, your ability, and your comfort level as well. So Tom called it exactly right. Areas for diving altitude are mountainous regions above 1,000 feet. High plains areas that are not obviously high altitudes as mountains and regions can be over 1,000 feet as well. So just because we don't see mountains in the background doesn't necessarily mean we're not at a high altitude area. So being aware of that and being aware of what we're doing is definitely a big key for you. So as we kind of go through this, one of the things that I'm going to switch this over to just me that I can encourage you guys to do is you can go to your phone.
Not a good idea. 5 minutes.
Let me close that up. Let's see. Da-da-da. You can download simple apps for your phone that work pretty good. And I'm just trying to get over to mine, such as the barometer. Let's see if it'll.
Oh, yeah.
That's working with the ring light. It's working really well. Let's see if we just turn that ring light off. So this is the barometer app, and unfortunately, it's not working so well, but it's got a nice barometer on there, and you can see there at the bottom that it's giving our actual atmospheric pressure at the station that is closest to us. I'm currently sitting at 4,724 feet of altitude, and sea level pressure is at 1.01, and atmospheric pressure at station is 0.85. So simple apps. It's free. It's easy. This is just the barometer app on my dive page. So I encourage definitely getting little apps like that and doing a little bit of preparation planning prior to any dive that you're planning on doing anyway, but especially if you're going to a new area and you're getting ready to get into something like high elevation. Before we dive Yellowstone, we generally get a weather forecast for the weekend prior, and we get the atmospheric pressure in metropascals, hectopascals before we go do our dives. So we're able to come up with at least a general idea of what we should be able to expect. Now, in terms of just your useless information for the day, the world record for highest dive world record was on December 13th, 2019. A Polish diver, Marcel Karokas, dived at an altitude of 20,981 feet above sea level, setting the absolute world record. He was the first person to dive at that altitude, and it's pretty hard to say, but I'm doubting that anybody's going to be able to beat that. Now, the question I have in that is I looked up and I said, well, what did they consider a dive? And he did a 5-minute dive at 10 feet. So in my mind, that's not a dive. 20 feet for 20 minutes. You can't get down to 20 feet for 20 minutes, then it's not a dive. So in my mind, he cheated as well. So in case you're wondering what the highest elevation dive was, that is definitely considered it. Now, some of the benefits of high altitude diving in the waters is one of the things you might not think about is finding things like preserved artifacts. For example, diving Yellowstone Lake, there you could dive around the old piers and dock stations around the hotel, and you'll be able to see original china, shoes. One of our dives over the summer, we found a glass ball that was let's see, it was blue. It was about this big. It looked like the ball for a toilet is what I thought it was. And that's honestly what I thought it was. It had an opening one side. It was really pretty blue. And so I went ahead and made the mistake of grabbing it and taking it out of the lake. We took it to the Rangers afterwards because I thought it was just trash, but they went through, spent some time and identified it. It turned out it was a fire extinguisher from the 50s. They used to have these chemical fire extinguishers that had a top on it. And what you do is you literally throw this whole piece of glass at the fire and it would absorb, it would hit it with chemicals. So they wanted to dispose of it. They were actually glad we pulled it out of the lake. But there's all kinds of other artifacts and interesting things you could find. Other things that are interesting, you could also, like the spires in Yellowstone Lake are definitely amazing as well. So preserved artifacts are definitely very interesting, whether geological or historical, right? We've dove the wreck of the EC Waters in Yellowstone Lake, which is a ship that was beached and marooned in the early 1900s. So definitely very, very interesting as well. Other cool things that are available out there, new varieties of underwater life. You can get into, for example, the river here. You can get into diving things like this sturgeon, and I've seen them anywhere from 4 to 8 feet long. And they're pretty patient. They allow you to come right up next to them. I mean, right next to them, and they'll sit there for 2, 3, 4 minutes while you dive next to them. So interesting, different fish that you just normally wouldn't see in the ocean. Other things, Nick and I also like diving the active geothermals in Yellowstone Lake and Mary Bay. And they're neat because as the geothermal water comes up, it's very hot, usually 250, 300 degrees at least. And it looks like vinegar coming up. It's a vertical haloclimate. It's very distorted. Or you'll see little sand volcanoes coming up. So definitely interesting things that allow you to see. The other thing is since we live inland, Tom lives in Colorado, the rest of us live in Idaho. It gives us a chance to extend our season since we don't live on the coast and we can't drive 5 minutes to the ocean. It gives us a chance to experience and continue diving. So as we kind of go through this, there's all kinds of cool opportunities. So let's get into a little bit about the atmosphere. When is a scuba cylinder empty, guys?
That's going to be whenever its pressure is equal to the pressure outside of the cylinder.
Absolutely. That would be when it's considered empty. Now, what happens if we take that empty cylinder? So your scuba cylinder is empty. When the pressure is equal to the absolute pressure, and there must be a difference in pressure to allow air to flow in and out of the cylinder. So your scuba cylinder is empty when it reaches 1 atmosphere or the equivalent atmosphere to what it's at. Now, what happens if we take that same cylinder at 1 atmosphere at sea level and we take it up to 16,000 feet? What's its atmospheric internal pressure?
1 atmosphere. Still, assuming it's sealed.
You're gonna have less atmospheric pressure, so that's gonna expand compared to a sea level pressure. So it's gonna come out of that cylinder, right?
Absolutely. It's going to be 50% difference. So when the valve and the is opened, air will flow out because the pressure is decreased, the volume is increased. Now, there's a law for that about pressure. Brian, what's that law?
Oh shoot. That would be Boyle's law, relating pressure and volume.
Boyle's law. Absolutely. We deal a lot with Boyle's law. As pressure increases, volume decreases, and as pressure decreases, volume increases. So we're dealing a lot with this. Now, here's one of the cool places that really comes into play. I was doing a dive with a student where I was teaching a solo class, and I had an additional safety single cylinder on my side at a higher percentage of nitrox. I want to say I had it at 50 or 60%, and I needed to breathe it off because it was I'd taken it down as an emergency cylinder, and it only had about 2/3 or half of the gas in it, and I wanted to refill it. And so I went ahead and took the time at 66 feet to breathe it down to 0. Now, as soon as it got down to 0 and I got that hard breath where there was nothing left, I went ahead and told my student, out of gas, we're heading to the surface, and we headed to 15 feet. Now, from 66 feet to 15 feet, how many breaths do you think I got? Tom, what do you think? How many breaths do you think you got? And this, by the way, this is a 30 cubic foot tank with a 32-inch hose on it.
1 to 2 breaths.
Almost 3.
All right.
Almost 3 breaths from 3 atmospheres up to half an atmosphere. So it just goes to show you that the atmospheric pressure that we deal with is extremely important. And this, in this case, an out of air ascent. This is why SSI tells you always leave your primary regulator in your mouth. As you ascend, the pressure decrease and volume increase. The air should flow into the delivery system, providing you some air upon ascent. So it's a lot what we're dealing with. So the atmospheric pressure that we're going to talk about is the air pressure at sea level is known as atmospheric pressure. The common unit of atmospheric pressure in the imperial system is ATA. So at sea level, 1 atmospheric pressure is considered 1 ATA. Now, we also deal with hydrostatic pressure. And hydrostatic pressure is the weight exerted by a fluid, like the water, due to the force of gravity. And hydrostatic pressure, guys, comes from the weight of the water, excluding air pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is commonly expressed in pressure per unit of depth, or PSI. Now, so what we call that is the hydrostatic pressure is Bernoulli's theory. And basically, it's the idea of the crushed can, right? We've all seen the submarine movie where they put a line on either side of the submarine, and as they go down, the line starts to droop because of the crushed can, right? That's what's going on. Is Bernoulli's law is stepping in and creating hydrostatic pressure. So here's where it gets a little different. Now, with ATA, the equivalent in water pressure in feet fresh water is 34 feet for every atmosphere, and in feet seawater is 33 feet seawater. So freshwater exerts 0.432 psi per foot, whereas saltwater exerts 0.445 psi per foot. Now, there's going to be a couple times I'm going to ask you guys to write some stuff down, tattoo it on your forehead, whatever it takes for you to remember these numbers, because these two numbers come up throughout all dive theory. 0.432 for feet freshwater, 0.445 for feet seawater. Now, overall, the weight of the water exerts 14.7 psi per foot. Divided by the 34 feet equals 0.432. So 4.7 psi is what freshwater exerts or saltwater exerts. But because of the weight of the salt in the water, it's slightly heavier. Make sense, guys?
Yep.
Now we've got a third measurement we need to be aware of, and that's gauge pressure. And gauge pressure is primarily used for divers' information systems. And gauge pressure does not take into account atmospheric pressure. So in other words, the specific pressure being measured does not include the atmospheric pressure. The depth gauge is calibrated to read 0 at the surface and measured the depth in feet seawater.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the nice thing is we now have more modern computers like the Shearwater, the Apex, whatever. I've got about 10 computers sitting around here. The Sunto, they all have an ability to change from feet seawater to feet freshwater. So one of the key things you want to make sure you're doing, if you're diving a dive computer, make sure that it's set to the correct salinity, whether it's if there is salt or not salt. And there should be a setting in your dive computer for that if it's worth anything as a dive computer, especially a dive computer, any kind of digital dive computer. Where that becomes a little bit of a challenge for you, just be aware. So we're using an old school manual steam gauge style SPG that will read in feet seawater. That's the only way they come. I have never seen a manual steam pump style SPG that reads in feet freshwater. So just be aware. 33 feet seawater, 34 feet freshwater for atmospheric differentiation pressure. So the last thing we need to be aware of is the absolute pressure. Brian, what do you think the absolute pressure would be?
So that would be that combination of atmospheric and hydrostatic pressure. So basically the total pressure being exerted wherever you're at.
Yeah, it's just like it sounds. It's kind of like, it's almost like asking what color is Custer's gray horse? Well, it's gray. If we're talking about the absolute pressure, we're talking about the total pressure exerted on an object, right? So the term absolute pressure is decided to describe the total pressure exerted on an object, you, the diver. Sitting on the surface, you are experiencing 1 atmosphere of pressure or the weight of the atmosphere pressure around you. Now, as you descend, there is an increase in this pressure due to the additional weight of the water, Bernoulli's law, or the hydrostatic pressure. And absolute pressure is the sum of the air or atmospheric pressure plus the hydrostatic pressure as well. And absolute pressure is commonly expressed in bar, or the water hydrostatic pressure increases at a rate of 1 additional atmosphere of pressure for every 33 feet seawater, 34 feet fresh water. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. We've gone through a lot so far. What questions do you have so far? All right. So one of the things that makes altitude diving a little bit different is the fact that we're dealing with rising and falling in the pressure column, right? Just like we take on nitrogen when we descend in the water column, if we come from 8,000 foot elevation to sea level, is our body off-gassing nitrogen?
Yes.
Yeah. How about if we go on a flight? We're in LA and we decide to go for a flight where the cabin pressure is pressurized to 10,000 feet, and we land wherever we're at. Are we off-gassing nitrogen?
The cabin pressure is pressurized at 10,000 feet. Do we land at 10,000 feet or above or below?
So we're landing in Idaho Falls at 4,500 foot elevation. Are we off-gassing?
No. You'd be on gassing, right?
You would be during the flight, right? If
You're on-gassing during the flight, absolutely, and you're off-gassing because one of the things that happens as we get to that new altitude, we start building up an equilibration at altitude. Upon ascent to altitude, 2 things happen. The body off-gasses excess nitrogen to come into equilibrium with the lower partial pressure of nitrogen in the atmosphere. it also begins a series of complicated adjustments to lower the partial pressure of oxygen. The process is called equilibration, and I have to keep it written in front of me because, by God, I can't remember that word to save my life. Now, the second is called acclimatization. Now, that's a much easier one. Now, approximately 12 hours at altitude is required for equilibration, and a longer period is required for full acclimation and acclimatization as well to the altitude. So remember, just like if we're at sea level and we descend to 60 feet, we're on gassing because of the additional pressure. As we come up from on gassing, we're off gassing that same nitrogen. So we have to be aware that as we travel up in altitude or down in altitude, something's happening, either on gassing or off gassing nitrogen. Now, have you ever thought about the idea that if I suddenly, because I had this happen, I flew from California, Camp Pendleton, California, to Denver, Colorado. That after the day after I got there, I decided to go for a nice run, and a nice 3-mile run, just to kind of not realizing that I was at mile high altitude, right? So I got a little sick. Anybody want to take a guess what that sickness might have been?
Altitude sickness.
Altitude sickness. But what else could we say that altitude sickness was? If we were in diving, and I suddenly forced a lot of off-gassing nitrogen out of my system, what would that be?
DCS.
DCS. Absolutely. Do you guys see a correlation there at all? If I go to a higher altitude, I off-gas a bunch of nitrogen more quickly, and I go on and I exercise or I get sick because of the new altitude. Would that be a lot like DCS?
Mm-hmm.
Nauseous, dizzy, headache. Those would all be symptoms of altitude sickness, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Could those be symptoms of DCS as well?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So hopefully that's something interesting for you guys, is that altitude sickness and DCS are in the same family. And they're very, very, very closely related. So being aware of that, right? That whether you realize it or not, you don't have to be in the water to go through a DCS issue. It's just that we call it DCS because we are diving and it's a diving sickness, right?
Hmm.
But altitude sickness, it's really a nitrogen sickness that we're having, right? So if we get DCS, we're having a nitrogen sickness, or we're getting sick because of the bubbles of the off gassing of bubbles in our bloodstream. But if we go to a higher altitude, we're getting altitude sickness, and we're getting sick because of an excessive off gassing of nitrogen in our bloodstream. So something to think about as you kind of go through this process. And one of the things that we need to make sure that as we ascend to these higher altitudes, Tom, I think we talked about that you like to drive from Denver to this lake that's not too far from Denver. What does that take you, about 2 hours to get there?
Yeah, about 2 hours.
Yeah, I looked it up on the map. It looked like about 2 hours.
Yeah.
So I'm just taking some guesses. As you're ascending in that atmospheric pressure, is that truthfully enough time when you first get there to be fully acclimatized for the nitrogen that you're at?
My body says no.
Yeah, absolutely. So acclimatization takes time, and it's one of those things to definitely be aware of. So as you kind of start thinking about that, would that kind of fall into the idea that as I rise in altitude and I get ready to dive, that I have nitrogen that's off gassing? Would that new dive be considered a repetitive dive or a fresh dive?
Repetitive.
Repetitive, yeah, absolutely. I've got a difference in nitrogen in my system. So equilibration at altitude. If a diver begins a dive at altitude within 12 hours of arrival, the residual nitrogen left over from sea level or the lower altitude has got to be taken into account. So in effect, the initial dive at altitude can be considered a repetitive dive, with the first dive having been considered the ascent from the lower altitude to the higher altitude. A simple way to figure this is to increase your residual nitrogen group by one letter group for every 1,000 feet of gain in elevation. So let's take a look at that. Let me share my screen with this. And I'm going to put my glasses on as well because I'm an old guy. So as we look at this is the simple, and this is available online. This is the simple dive tables from SSI. So Jim drives from Idaho Falls, which is an elevation of 4,500 feet, to Yellowstone Lake at the elevation of 7,500 feet. Then Jim gains 3,000 feet in elevation. Now, to compensate for this elevation increase, Jim will need to start his dive as a D group diver or wait 5 hours and 49 minutes to return to being an A group diver. So we talked about this. So we're going to change one letter group for every 1,000 feet. So we move from A to B, 1, from B to C, 2, from C to D, 3. So that's 3,000 feet of elevation. So now he is a D group diver. So as we start looking into this, we know that he is a D group diver, and that's where we're going to start our residual nitrogen track as a D group diver. Now, simply enough, if we don't want to be a D group diver and we want to consider this a brand new dive, 5 hours and 49 minutes to return to being an A group diver. Now we shouldn't need to have a much deeper expression of the dive tables and understand what D group diver is and what that residual nitrogen point is, but I certainly can have that conversation if we need to. Does anybody need to kind of go over table 3?
I'm good.
Tom?
Yeah, I think I've got a pretty good handle on that.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure if you guys need to, I can certainly do that. It's not a problem at all. So overall, it's easy enough just to make sure that we have a set of dive tables with us so we can start getting a better idea of what that residual nitrogen point is. So Tom, what the altitude of Denver is what, 6,000 feet?
The city is actually 5,280. I'm at like 55.
Okay. So we'll say 5,500, and you like to dive at 10,500 feet, correct?
Yeah, it varies just under 10 to right at 11. So
if we just use that, that'd be a 5,000 foot gain in elevation. So
Okay.
simple enough, Jim, as you rise in elevation from where you're at to where you want to dive, you're going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is going to make you an F group diver. So if you wanted to not count this as a repetitive dive, your first dive needs to either start as an F group diver, and that residual nitrogen point is an F group diver, or you need to camp out there for at least 7 hours. 7 hours and 6 minutes.
yeah.
Easy enough. And Jim, if you'd like, I can send you these dive tables. I have them as a PDF, and I'm happy to send them out. They're available online if you want to look for them, or I could just send them out. Just need to let me know.
Okay. Yeah, I was using the SSI app. They got that table on there.
Absolutely. And guys, that's a great opportunity. If you wouldn't mind, open up your My SSI app for me and show me real quick. In the lower right-hand side of that, you'll see where it says More. If you go to More, and then go to the lower left where it says Tables. And we're looking for the combined air tables. And if it were me, I'd switch it over to Imperial before I open it up. So Tom, as an F group diver, that tells me that if you're going to do an 80-foot dive, that you, as an F group diver, that you have 28 minutes of residual nitrogen already built up and a 2-minute dive time for an 80-foot dive. Do you see that on table 3?
I'm on table 2.
Go to table 3 for me, if you would. Just scroll down a little bit.
Ah, who knew? All right. Okay, I got table 3.
There you go. So as an F group diver, if you scroll down, green is go, white is penalty. So as for an 80-foot dive on air, that means you have 2 minutes of dive time before you'll go in as a residual dive with that 5,000 foot gain.
Okay.
You see that? You guys all see that?
Mm-hmm.
So you said an 80-foot dive, is that correct?
Yep. 80-foot dive gives you 2 minutes of dive time and 28 minutes of residual nitrogen
Gotcha. Yep.
as an F group diver. So spending a little time at altitude and relaxing for a little bit. So as an F group diver, for example, if you were just to hang out there for an hour and a half, that would change you to a D group diver. And at 80 feet, that would change you to 12 minutes of dive time at 80 feet. Just by hanging out there and getting your gear put together. If you're like me, Tom, I get up to these high altitude lakes. It's hard for me to get in the water in less than 2 hours of dive time. So I'm not the fastest in the world. So 2.5 hours would take you to a C group diver. And as a C group diver, 80 feet gives you 17 minutes of dive time to 80 feet. So that's the first thing to be aware of, is the fact that this is a residual dive. Or a repetitive, a residual. Yeah, residual nitrogen, and it's a repetitive dive. So overall, having this dive table definitely is a nice, easy way to kind of keep that in front of you and be aware that whatever you think you're diving, you're not. The other thing to be aware of on this as well is that your dive computer will not take into account that change in elevation. Your dive computer, and this is one of the limitations of dive computers in this diving, is that if you're going to a higher elevation from a lower elevation, it begins your residual nitrogen count at the beginning of the dive. It's not measuring residual nitrogen prior to a dive, and that's extremely important for you to notice and be aware of, because if you're not taking into account the fact that this is a residual nitrogen dive, or repetitive dive, you're jumping into a higher chance of things like DCS than you probably want to be a part of.
Are there any dive computers where you can manually set that?
Unfortunately, no.
Before the
Nope.
I have a question, Benjamin.
Yes, sir.
If I turn my dive computer on at home and then head up, will that?
Nope.
No? Okay.
That's what it's saying. And one of the big limitations to dive computers is the fact that they don't start recording and measuring residual nitrogen until they begin to start a dive.
Gotcha.
They actually have to go into a pressure mode where they're beginning a dive. And the other problem is that, as you can see, I've got one of my computers sitting right here. It's in the off mode, and most likely I'm going to throw up my dive bag and I'm going to drive to wherever I'm driving, and then I'll turn it on just before I get into the dive because I don't want to waste the battery, right? So that's the other problem. But even if I did just get really slick and say, okay, I'm turning my computer on now and it's doing its thing, it's not going to record a residual nitrogen point of where I'm at to where I'll be at in altitude. They're only designed to measure for diving, which really sucks. So the manufacturers haven't really figured out the idea that, wait a minute, maybe people do travel for diving. Maybe they don't all dive in the damn ocean. Someday, I tell you. Now, one of the cool things to kind of jump off on a slight tangent for you is that with altitude diving, you get the opportunity to learn something about ice and cold water. Now, the amazing thing is as water gets colder, it turns to ice, and just gives you the opportunity to extend your diving season even further. Now, one of the things we do teach is ice diving, and it's one of my favorite courses to teach. Absolutely positively love ice diving. It's about a 3-hour course and then 2 dives under the ice. And we go through and we teach all the key safety features involved in that as well. Now, we're going to cover some of the key pieces of the hypothermia and exposure, but we're definitely need to be aware of that you want to extend your season all year. You need to get a chainsaw and take a course. Ice diving is a lot of fun, though. And by the way, I happen to be an ice diving certified instructor as well. So let's remove that back. All right. So one of the things that we've been kind of talking about, we kind of dancing around a little bit, is the idea of Boyle's law. And the idea of Boyle's law is that as ambient pressure increases, volume decreases. And the easiest way to think about Boyle's law and the pressure of the partial pressures we're dealing with are my handy dandy sponges. If you haven't had the joy of seeing my sponges, I cut up one of my wife's sponges. She was very upset until I promised I'd buy more sponges at the market. And while I have not done that, I do still have the sponges. So the nice thing about this particular sponge I like is that it looks pretty similar. It's about 21% here of dark blue and 79% of the lighter blue, which indicates this would be one molecule of air that we're breathing, which is 21% what, Brian?
Oxygen.
Yep. And 79% what, Caleb?
Nitrogen.
Absolutely. And we're going to use the general terms of it's technically 79.9 with 0.1% being argon and xenon and zargon and every other weird thing out there and carbon dioxide and everything else. But we're just going to say 79.21 for government use, right? So here's what happens. We've got this one molecule of air at the surface, and it's taking up about 1 square inch, right, of time. But if we go down to 34 feet fresh water, we have compression, and we now have 2 molecules of air in the same amount of space as 1 molecule of air would occupy at the surface. So because of pressure, Bernoulli again, we come into the idea of increased partial pressure. And now instead of having 21% oxygen in there, now we have the equivalent of 42% oxygen occupying the same amount of space. Now, one of the things to be aware of is if I have 1 sponge, it weighs, we'll say, 1 ounce. If I have 2 sponges, it weighs how much, Tom?
2 ounces.
2 ounces. And if I have 3 sponges?
3 ounces.
3 ounces, absolutely. So now, while it's easier to think about it in the terms of weight, it's also, as we get these compressed, they become what? Are they thinner or thicker?
Thinner.
Thicker.
Thinner.
They're thicker in density. They're more dense, if you will. Now, with weight and density, it's something to be aware of that. And I want to just kind of touch on this briefly, that density of the gas is extremely important for you to be aware of. As we start increasing the gas density, we increase the body's need to work harder in its cardiovascular system as well. As the body increases its work in the cardiovascular system, the body is not able to off-gas that carbon dioxide as easily. We have a carbon dioxide retention. Does that make sense, guys?
Mm-hmm.
So as we have this higher carbon dioxide density, let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. Sometimes I love my Mac and sometimes not so much. Here we go. Pull another screen over. We have the idea of gas weight. So add to stage here. And I'm just going to go over this briefly. This is not a science of diving class, but it is just a basic idea that we need to understand that as gas gets denser, it gets heavier as well and harder to breathe. So everything has a weight. For example, oxygen weighs 1.428 grams per liter. Hydrogen, interesting enough, is only 0.09 grams per liter. Helium, which is a common gas for used in diving, is 0.179 grams per liter. And nitrogen is 1.251 grams per liter. Now, as we start increasing in our depth, we know that the gas density at 1 atmosphere is 1.29 grams per liter. Now, a recent study from the University of Auckland, New Zealand, they started doing tests on the gas density and how that affected divers. And what they found was that the maximum gas density a diver should dive is 5.2 grams per liter, with an absolute limiting factor of 6.2 grams per liter. Okay. Now let's look at that for just a second. If we're diving air and I go to 99 feet, all of a sudden I'm at 99 feet on air is 5.15 grams per liter. Now, we just talked about it a minute ago that 5.2 grams per liter is the maximum density that we should be diving, with a hard limit of 6.2 grams per liter. So I just happen to have down here grams per liter, this a nice little chart, that if we go to 100 feet, we're now at 5.21 grams per liter. And if we go to 125 feet, we're now diving 6.2 grams per liter gas density weight. We're getting into some dangerous stuff. So just be aware as you guys go deeper, you need to be aware that the gas density and pressure, weight of the gas is definitely going to become problematic and concerning. So be aware of that. And if you'd like to learn more about that, we teach that all in tech and very detailed and also in science diving. But for the idea in here, just be aware that gas does have weight and density. And as it becomes more dense, it definitely becomes more concerning as well.
Hey, Ben,
Yes, sir.
would the equivalent depth make that easier to breathe since you've got less total pressure with your less atmospheric pressure? In other words, how does that affect it at altitude with that density? Or is there a negligible effect?
That is a great question, and there's a lot of debate on this right now, Tom. Overall, we use the equivalent depth for gas density weight because because of the acclimatization factor. Your body acclimatizes. For example, right now I'm at 0.85. So we utilize 0.85 as our controlling factor and utilize that to move forward so that when I get to an equivalent depth, which if I'm diving 100 feet here, it's equal to 121 feet. I use the 121 feet for my gas weight density because my body is acclimatized to the 0.85. So now the gas weight density has become heavier per my body. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there is a debate on this. Absolutely. And there's differing opinions. My opinion is use the sled depth, the sea level equivalent depth, which we're going to get to in just a little bit, and how to figure that out for determining what your gas density that you should be aware of is based upon acclimatization. Right. Now, in truth, in hardcore physics, you'd use the actual depth. But because of acclimatization, you use the sled depth, the sea level equivalent. That, Tom, by the way, that was a great question. So as we kind of move through this, we get the idea that atmospheric pressure has a definite effect on everything we're doing. So, Brian, at sea level, a flexible gas-filled container is submerged to 33 feet seawater. At this depth, it has a volume of 1 cubic foot. What will the volume of the container be if it's brought directly to surface? 33 feet seawater, 1 cubic foot.
Yep. So bringing that directly should be 2 cubic feet when you bring it up because you're having the pressure, so you should double the volume.
Exactly. Good job. By the way, that is a test question. You passed. Overall. I sneak my test questions in all over the place, right? That's my sneaky way about me, right? There is a test. We'll go through it all together. As long as you guys pay attention, which you guys are doing a fantastic job of, you will absolutely positively pass. All right. So dive planning, sea level equivalent depth. Now, this is the hard way of doing it. Theoretical depth calculations for altitude. Now, samples should be calculated on the sea level equivalent depth table using either atmospheric ATM or hectopascal pressure units. Note, most common dive tables rely on a minimum hydrostatic cap of 1.0 atmospheres at the surface. Now, the formula is pretty simple. Equivalent depth equals the actual depth times pressure 1 divided by pressure 2. I'm sure I've lost you at this point. It's okay. It gets pretty simple from here. So the example for the equivalent depth of 49 feet seawater at 4,000 feet above elevation is done this way. We find out that our atmospheric pressure at 4,000 feet seawater is 0.864. So simple enough. We're going to divide 1 by 0.864. When we divide out 1 divided by 0.864, we come up with 1.157. Simple enough. All we need to do is multiply out our depth by that 1.157, and we get our equivalent depth. Our sea level equivalent depth now becomes 57 feet. So simple enough, we're taking pressure 1 and divided by pressure 2 from the altitude pressure variations. Now, note, safety stop depth modifications should also be modified. So if I'm diving and I want to do a 10-foot safety stop, I need to also realize that I'm diving 15%, almost 16% deeper than what I think I'm diving. So for example, in this case, if I'm diving 100 feet, I'm actually diving 115.7 feet or almost 116 feet, utilizing this example. Now, this is straight from the Navy dive tables and they pulled it from the NOAA Diving Manual 4th edition. So simple enough, the atmospheric pressure divided by 1 gives you your variance. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
So
Pressure 1 is the altitude.
Yep. Pressure 1 is sea level. Pressure 2 is at altitude. So divide one from the other. So in that case, if you guys have your calculators handy, we'll pull up the atmosphere right now for Idaho Falls is 0.8523. 0.8523. So what is our pressure variation?
Be about 17% more.
Yep, 17% more. And that is the most accurate way to determine your dive parameters, is figuring out based upon this. Now, there are cases, for example, where we go in Yellowstone Lake. I don't always got internet connection, and I'm not always able to pull up my atmospheric pressure. So simple enough, having a quick table like this is definitely very handy. In the case of something like Yellowstone Lake, we're diving 7,700 foot elevation, so I'll simply round up for safety. I mean, I can certainly divide it out and get an exact PSI, but simple enough, I can just use 0.743 to figure out what my equivalent level depth is, and utilize that as my dive planning. Does that make sense, guys?
Yes.
Now, how we're doing that is basically we're taking the atmospheric pressure. This is a screenshot from my the little free app that I've got, and oddly enough, it's pretty darn close. It's saying 0.853, and so what we can do if we want to get even further in accuracy, we can utilize the division of the current atmospheric pressure divided by the sea level equivalent pressure, and it gives us an actual differentiation. In this particular case, it's 15% deeper, 15.86% deeper than actual depth. Now, this is the hard way to do it, guys. And as I promised you guys earlier, I've given you guys the harder way to do it. I can also send this out. I've got a set of notes that I can send off to you as well. Now, there are easier ways to do this. First off, the easiest way is you can simply go to divebuddy.com mobile calculator altitude ASPC. And I'm going to pull that up so you guys can see it. There we go. And this is a free app online. So we're at, let's see. I am sitting right now at 4,720 feet. 4,720 feet. I'm going to go dive right by my house to a dive of 92 feet in the river. Here we go. Scuba diving at an altitude of 4,720 feet is at to an actual depth of 92 feet. Your theoretical depth is 107 feet seawater. The depth of your safety shop should be 13 feet freshwater, and the surface air pressure at that altitude is 0.8408. Now, we know from the barometric pressure that it's right now it's 0.85, but at 100th of a hectopascal off, we're not going to be that far off. We're going to be pretty darn close. So in terms of being worried about being a 100th off, I'm not. That'll give me a good idea for my dive planning. That's the simplest way to do it. But what if you don't have the internet? Here's a simple calculation. For every 1,000 feet you ascend, add 3.5% to your depth.
3.5% for every 1,000 feet.
If you can remember that, you'll be safe. Now, while that's slightly off, and there's times on the barometric pressure scale, because it's an algorithm rhythm, that I've seen it between 3.2, 3.4, 3.5, and 3.6. 3.5% average was averaged plus a 0.1% of safety margin built in. So simple enough, if you add 3.5%. So let's look at that for a minute. If we did a 5,000 foot dive, or elevation foot dive, that's 5 times 3.5, means we're diving 17%, 17.5% difference. At 5,000 feet or 1,000 feet, we're still in the ballpark. We're still close enough to say, oh yeah, we're good to go. We're close. Now, barometric pressure or the app for the phone is absolutely the most accurate, but adding 3.5% to every 1,000 feet will get you within the ballpark and keep you much safer. There are other things like Subsurface Dive Planning app is a great way to go. It's a dive planning software that does not require the internet, that will actually allow you to plan your dives based upon the atmospheric pressure that you're currently at, and as well as it will come up with an equivalent of what it feels the atmospheric pressure should be based upon the elevation. It's free software. I don't encourage going out and buying any software, but I like Subsurface and I use it for all my tech planning as well. The other thing you can also do is you can get the sea level equivalent depth table. And it's not a bad thing. Print this off and put it with your dive gear, and it gives you a good idea in terms of dive planning. So having some paper charts with you, never a bad idea. Fair enough, guys? But as I promised, we can certainly do the math the hard way. Divide atmospheric pressure at your current location by sea level and get the actual difference. Or you can add 3.5% for every 1,000 feet, or you can use the Dive Buddy app if you have internet. So I encourage writing that down. And again, at the end of this, I have a set of notes that I can send everybody as a PDF. Simple. Now, let's see. Oh, here we go. So I'm going to bring. So a flexible gas-filled container is submerged to 33 feet at an altitude of 3,000 feet. At that depth, it has a volume of 1 cubic foot. What will the volume be when it reaches the surface? Two cubic feet, 1.3 cubic feet, 1.5 cubic feet, or 2.21 cubic feet? Tom, what do you think?
Delta 2.21. I'm guessing because you've got four atmospheres, well, 3. So it's going to be bigger than 2.
We got 2 atmospheres because you're at 33 feet freshwater.
Okay. Yeah. So it'd be more than double. Sorry.
Yeah. 34 feet freshwater. There was an error there. So got that fixed. 3,000 feet. But because we're at 3,000 feet, we are now 3,000 feet. For 30 feet, we're actually at 35 feet. So we're actually deeper than what we think. Or we could use the math and we could say, okay, we're 3.5% times 3. So we're increasing by 7%. So 2.21 feet. Sound about right? Does that make sense? So we've added 3.5% for every 1,000 feet.
So
Yeah, it'd be
it's
close
10.
to 10%, right?
Yep.
So 33 times.
So 10.5%. So strictly speaking, it's 2.21 cubic feet. But you can come up with the answer pretty quickly by looking at the overall and saying, okay, if I use my quick math for 34 feet freshwater, so 34 feet times 1.105, you're actually at 37.57 feet. But yeah, you're coming from deeper than what you think. So, Caleb, what is the most accurate way to determine your sea level equivalent depth?
Calculating it with the exact pressure.
Exactly. That is absolutely the most accurate of all of them, if using your actual atmospheric pressure. Now, Brian, as we kind of go through this process, knowing that we're deeper than what we think and we're going deeper faster than what we think, how would this affect your ascent rate?
So with that, you should probably, I guess that would be overall slow your ascent rate, because instead of ascending at the normal, whatever you would do before, since you're actually deeper, or your sled depth is deeper than actual depth, you need to go slower to match basically that ascent rate for your sled depth. So for your actual time, it needs to be a slower ascent rate.
Absolutely. So if I'm at 10,000 feet, I'm actually ascending 35% faster than what I think I am.
So every
Right.
foot you ascend, you're actually 35. It's the equivalent of ascending a foot and a little less than a half or something like that.
Yep. Just under a foot and a half. So if I'm used to 33 feet per minute, I really should probably slow that ascent rate down to more like 16 or 17 feet per minute, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So slow your ascent rates down. Now, utilizing that information as well, how would that affect my safety stop, Caleb?
You should adjust your safety stop a little bit lower in the water column, because, again, that depth variance, or that sled equivalent, is applicable all the way down the water column, not just at your lower depth.
Absolutely. So, Tom, if I typically do my safety stop at 20 feet, that's what I'm accustomed to. But I'm diving at 10,000 feet. Where should my new safety stop be?
If you're normally at 20, maybe call it 14 feet or something.
Yeah, 12 to 14 feet in that area. Absolutely. I need to be. Now, Tom, would there be any additional consideration for traveling after altitude diving?
Yes.
How so?
Well, like you were talking about, like if you're leaving that site and you're dropping down from the mountains, you're good to go. If you're going over a big pass or something, that's something you want to think about. Maybe delay your trip.
Absolutely. So you want to make sure you're cognizant of the fact that your nitrogen level is based upon your current altitude. Now, in terms of heading up in elevation, now is there a problem if I'm at 7,000 feet and there's no mountain passes and I can come straight down? Is there any considerations or concerns of that? And if so, why?
I would think going down would be good.
Well, it'd be the same as going back in the water, right? You're
Well,
going to be on gassing because you're increasing pressure, right? You're building up nitrogen again. Nikki, what do you think?
I was gonna say, isn't that like recompressing a diver, like if you had a situation of DCS and we're advised not to take them back into the water. So if you're decreasing in altitude.
Absolutely. It's the same thing. It's decreasing. Now, here's the challenge. Who has been to a lake that you can literally go to without exiting from, that you don't have to at least go up in altitude somewhere? Is that pretty rare?
Yeah, it's pretty rare. I mean, I could think of a couple that I've been in Rocky Mountain National Park, but even then, there's a chance you can go up a couple 100 feet.
Yeah, most lakes are going to be in a depression portion, and so you're going to have to go down to get to them, right? So be aware, the majority of lakes out there, you're going to have to ascend in altitude to get away out of them, as a general rule of thumb. The crater is probably the best example of that. And interestingly enough, when you sign your waiver at the crater, you are agreeing that you will keep your ascent rates at 20 feet per minute, by the way. It's on the paperwork. So just an example. So question for you, Tom. Let's see. From the SSI altitude pressure variation table, what is the atmospheric pressure at 4,000 feet?
A864.
Exactly. And yes, that is a test question. I try and go through all the test questions ahead of time. All right, Brian, your question is, a diver plans a dive at 4,000 feet to 70 feet fresh water. What is the sea level equivalent depth or the sled?
So that's going to be real quick. I'm going to go with C, 80 feet.
C, 80 feet is right. How'd you come up with your work?
So with that, looking at that pressure variation table for 4,000 feet, your pressure is 0.864. So I divided 1 by 0.864, which got, I think it was about 1.17, then multiply that by 70. So that 17% on top of 70 feet, which came out to 81 feet. So I'd go 80 feet as the correct answer.
Absolutely. Now, what would happen if you multiplied 4 times 3.5%?
So they give you, I guess it'd be about 14%, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it comes out pretty close to
you could, yep.
As you saw, it's within 2 feet. And much like the 6-inch rule, what's 2 feet among friends, right? I gotta take the jokes where I can get them, right? Now, as we kind of go through this process, we've talked a fair amount of high-level topics as well. If you're interested in kind of going through and understanding a little bit more, we do teach science of diving, and we go through a lot more hardcore of the math and how to come up with a lot of this. But we also go through the idea of gas densities and how those affect you more accurately as well. So be aware of science of diving. Great course. Love teaching it. I have a hard time teaching science of diving in just 4 sessions. It is a very heavy subject, and there's a lot to it. I think, Caleb, I think you and Brian have both taken science of diving from me, haven't you?
Yep. We survived it together.
There we go. So science of diving, I got my last couple classes online, but it's a great class. I really enjoy teaching it. And every time I teach it, I add at least 10%. So one of these days it's going to be a 3-month course. It's just so much information.
I'm glad I got it in before the inflation hit.
So on that note, so Henry's Law is another law that there's a lot of laws that we deal with in diving. Henry's Law is one of my favorites. And Henry's Law states that at a constant temperature, the amount of any given gas, dissolved in a given liquid of volume is directly proportionate to the partial pressure of the gas in equilibrium to that liquid. Now, the law essentially has 2 parts to it, and it says as pressure increases, the solubility of the gas of the liquid increases. The second part that wasn't in this, it goes a little farther into it. The second part of it is as temperature increases, the solubility of the gases in the liquid decreases. Now, simplistic terms, under more pressure, a greater quantity of gas will be absorbed by a liquid. Secondly, the colder the gas, the more gas can be absorbed by it. And as a liquid warms up, the gas escapes from it. So as we kind of look at that idea that gas is more soluble into the mix when it's cold. Why is that important?
Because a lot of altitude diving might also be cold diving.
It's all cold diving. Absolutely. So there's two parts of that.
Well,
like
maybe not the crater, but
not the crater. Fair enough. The crater is a whole different story. But there's two parts of that. So one of the fun parts of this, let's see, we're on 35. I'm going to share my screen again. Here's a picture of me diving the other day in the river. This was from, I believe this is Saturday, wasn't it?
Oh, that was Sunday.
Sunday. This is from Sunday. So on my back, I've got 2 tanks for a total of about 100 pounds. I've got a dry suit on, dry gloves, a thick undergarment, a full face mask, 2 hoods, a camera, and my tech fins. Is any of that light?
oh, breezy.
Absolutely. 200 pounds with extra gear. So as we know, and as we kind of talked about through this process, is that we're diving altitude, which is a lower partial pressure, a lighter gas. So it takes more gas to be able to fill the same amount of volume, right? So we're breathing heavier. Anybody ever go jump off a plane at 5,000, 6,000 foot elevation after being at sea level and try to go for a run? Altitude sickness, right? We have less gas and it takes more gas and we have to breathe harder to absorb that oxygen into our system.
But I want to know, have you tried that?
Yes. Absolutely. About killed myself. So been there, done that, got the t-shirt. It sucked. When I left Camp Pendleton, I was averaging 17 minutes for 3-mile runs. My first month in Denver during my school there, I was averaging 21 minutes for all my runs, and they started getting faster and faster. I finally got back down to my 17-minute 3-mile runs, but it took a bit. So it takes more effort to accomplish the same thing. So there's 2 parts of Henry's law that are important to be aware of. The first one, obviously, is the easy one when it comes to gas density and cold. As the gas is colder, it absorbs more into our body. Now, Tom, what do you think gas absorbing into my body might be important to be aware of?
Your nitrogen load.
Yeah, I'm loading up nitrogen much faster because of the cold than I would be if it were warm, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, how about the proportionate to the pressure at equilibrium when we start talking Henry's law and the agitation factor of it. So Henry's law has an agitation factor. So the more it's agitated, the more the gas it dissolves in the liquid. So if I'm having to breathe heavier, would it mean that I'm absorbing more gas into my tissue structure?
Yes.
Absolutely. So there's 2 factors of Henry's law that are important to be aware of. The first one is, in my opinion, is the cold. Cold gas absorbs into tissue faster because it's more dense. It's able to go into the tissue compartments more quickly. The second part of that is if I'm diving at altitude, I'm having to work harder to do the same things. I'm carrying a crap load more gear, which is causing me to work even harder than I would. I promise you, diving in the Caribbean or Hawaii with 2 tanks is much different than diving at 5,000 foot elevation with 2 tanks because of the dry, because of that, right? You get all this extra crap, and then you add an FFM where you reduce your ability to uptake gas even more, and it becomes a bigger problem. So I'm going to be breathing heavier. I'm going to be on gassing more. So we learned one that we should slow our ascents because of altitude. But how do you think that might affect our safety stop time?
Should increase it a little bit.
Absolutely. Why?
Well, just a little bit more margin, conservative margin, but you're allowing a little more time for that off gassing at a lower rate. So you don't want your off gassing rate to be too high. So you're allowing for that a little bit more before you ascend all the way to the surface.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things to be aware of as well is as we get ready to get out of the water, we're carrying all this extra crap and gear, and there's less gas as well. So because of that, the agitation is going to increase. And we're going to off gas much faster once we get out of the water as well. So we're more prone for getting DCS, getting out of the water, because we're carrying a crap ton of stuff, right? We're working harder, or we're having to breathe faster. So the agitation factor has kicked in. So longer safety stops. So due to these additional considerations, safety stops and ascents must be much more closely monitored for the safety of the diver. The safety stops of 3 to 5 minutes at or near 15 feet are recommended for any dive made to a dive depth deeper than 20 feet, unless an emergency or other safety-related reasons dictate otherwise. Now, because of most altitude dives are done in higher elevations, and the divers are more prone to cold and reduced blood flows to the extremities, it's also strongly recommended that the following procedures are implemented. Ascent rates should be reduced by 5 feet per minute or more for every 4,000 feet of elevation. Let's say that again. Reduce your ascent rates by at least 5 feet per minute for 4,000 feet of elevation. Safety stops should be adjusted to the correct theoretical depth based upon the dive site. And safety stop time should be increased by a factor of 20% or more for every 4,000 feet of elevation gain. Now, the last factor I want to talk about is, and when you start getting into this, in kind of driving this whole point home, because there's a lot of factors to be involved with. We talked about theoretical depth. We're moving faster than what we think. We talked about Henry's law, the idea that cold gas is denser and absorbs more quickly in our tissues. We also talked about Henry's law because we're at a higher elevation. We're having to work harder and breathe harder, and we're absorbing more gas than what we think. And we also talked about Henry's law in reference to carrying all this crap out of the damn river. But Tom, when I go into hypothermia, what's one of the things that happens to my blood flow?
It's gonna shunt your blood to your core.
Ding, 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 ding. So tell me about blood shunting.
Your body's basically trying to preserve your organs when it's kind of a survival mode, if you will.
Absolutely. So a couple things happen. Well, the first one is as we start getting cold, we go into vasoconstriction. And what that means is the venous system starts reducing the size of the veins. And just like a garden hose, if I have a smaller garden hose, I can't push as much water through it, right? Same thing with the venous system. Vasoconstriction basically is telling me that I'm not able to push as much blood flow through. Now, in this venous system, Brian, if I'm not able to push as much blood through, am I able to off gas at the same rate?
No,
not at all.
So I mean, if
So vasoconstriction says that the blood's not flowing as well. So if the blood's not flowing as well, just like with dehydration, if the blood doesn't flow well, I'm not able to off gas as nicely as well as I want to. So blood shunting and vasoconstriction come together into one harmonious little wondrous thing that our magical body does, and our bodies haven't evolved to the point where it fixes this automatically for us. They're just trying to protect the heart, brain, lungs, and liver, right? That's their goal. So they shut us out. They stop flowing as much blood out to the extremities, and the veins shunt out and constrict. So all of a sudden, if that's happening, should I take an additional consideration when it comes to ascent rates and safety stops?
Yes.
Yeah, there are a lot of things coming together. So I think you guys are starting to get the bigger picture here that as we're starting to dive at altitude, there's a lot of things happening to our body because of reduced atmospheric pressure, because of increased depths, because of cold, because of heavy gear, because of there's just a lot of pieces coming together. So now I think you're starting to get the bigger picture that diving at altitude definitely creates additional challenges and concerns that you have to be aware of. Make sense, guys?
Yep.
So that's the thing to be aware of. So now, one of the things we've discovered, and a good way to avoid DCS is being warm, right? One of the things you want to make sure is you're warm during your dive. One of the key things is making sure you wear the proper exposure protection, and things like dry suits make a huge bit of difference in this. Now, one of the key ways to avoid DCS is to make sure we are warm during our safety stops, warm throughout our dives, that we're not getting cold, because as we start getting cold, we're increasing the chances of DCS considerably. Other things we want to make sure, it's very easy at altitude to also get dehydrated. Hydration in cold weather is paramount. Make sure you're drinking plenty of water. As we talked about the blood flow, we want to make sure that the blood is able to flow correctly. Talking about dehydration made me thirsty. We want to make sure that we're going through and that we're well hydrated through this process as well. Drinking warm liquids. If you're drinking cold liquids, it's causing your body to cool from the interior out. Drinking warm liquids creates the need for the body to create less energy to warm that up, and helps increase the body's ability to stay warm. Other things to be aware of, diving at altitude, it's usually cold out there. Nikki and I did a dive a few years ago at Redfish Lake, 6,500 foot elevation in early June. We ended up going in the bathrooms to get dressed because it was snowing. We were diving wet gloves, and when we got into the water, which the water was 38 degrees, it felt warm because the air temperature was 0. So having a good shelter, somewhere to go where you can get warm, is huge. One of the key things that we do during when we ice dive is we have an ice tent, and just having the ice tent gives us somewhere to go that's at least 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the exterior temperature. We usually put a heater in it as well, and getting that thing up to 80 degrees makes a huge difference as well. It keeps our bodies warm as we go through this process. Now, I think we already talked about this. One of my questions is for you, Brian, is how do you think cold affects your nitrogen loading and off-gassing?
Yeah, so kind of like you had talked about, when you get that vasoconstriction, that the exchange of gas is going to happen a lot slower. So you're going to onload much lower, but you're also going to off-gas it slower.
Perfect. Now, Tom, how do you think reduced atmospheric pressure would affect your surface intervals?
I'd assume it's going to make it longer. Require you to spend more time up there.
Absolutely. Good answer. Now, as we kind of get ready for these big dives, we've really kind of gone through a lot of the dangers and ideas with this. Now, pre-dive safety checks is a huge thing with this. Each diver should conduct a functional check of all gear and equipment before your dive. Particularly pay attention to things like regulators and inflators as well. Perfect example, I had my BPN wing with my twin sets in the back of my truck, and I left it out there. Was it last week or week before?
It was Saturday.
Saturday, I left. Yeah, it was this past Saturday. I left it in the back of the truck, and I hadn't drained the wing as well as I should have after the last dive. We get out to the dive site, and the inflator was frozen shut. And the butt dump valve was frozen shut. Definitely not good. Now, other things to be aware of is free flows. As you're starting to dive colder water, I was experimenting and trying a new first stage that I hadn't dove in cold water before. I was diving the Atomic M1, and I just discovered that it was not designed for extreme cold weather. You got to remember, as the pressure of the tank is decompressing, it's getting colder. So typically the air that's coming out of your tank is around 20 to 30 degrees colder than the air temperature around it. Now, the air temperature on Saturday was 20 degrees. The water temperature was 31 degrees. So as the air came out of my first stage during my dive, I got down to 91 feet. I was at 34 feet. The air was coming out at around 5 degrees probably. It absolutely froze over solid and harder than my head. It was that thing was and I was diving in FFM, and while I certainly could have gone to the safety procedure of isolating out, turning off the vent, taking my mask off, putting my safety second in, grabbing my spare mask and putting my mask on, the water was 32 degrees, 33 degrees. I still had 2,500 pounds of gas between two tanks, which is equal to 5,000 pounds of gas. I just did an ascent. I had plenty of gas. A little redundancy definitely goes a long way, but making sure to check these things before you get in the water. Don't just jump in the water and assume everything's good. Check it for free flow and leakage before the dive. And if you do have a problem, postpone the dive until the malfunction is corrected. If a regulator or inflator valve is found to be free flowing at the surface, it is virtually certain that it will free flow at depth. Now, likewise, divers should perform pre-checks and buddy checks with their fellow divers before each dive. And it can be easy to forget simple things like a suit inflator. Check your suit or a strap, and quick check to make sure that everything was working good at the start of every dive. Divers should go through over hand signals as well that they might use in emergency or otherwise. A quick review of the dive plan and whatever hazards might be present during the oncoming dive. For example, diving the river is a good example. When we get ready to dive the river, there are lava tubes and there's overheads that you can get into that are down there if you're not careful. Being aware of this. There's also only 4 to 5 feet of viz right now, which is actually about 5 times higher than what it normally is. I've dove, Nikki will tell you, we've dove the river with 2 inches of viz, where if you couldn't see your hand within 3 inches, you couldn't see it all. It was this much viz. It definitely be aware. So being aware of those little things and prepared for them is key. Nikki was able to stay with me during the dive because she could touch me throughout the whole dive. She was literally stuck to me like glue. Now, it is also recommended that if a diver is going to be at a site that is far away, they bring along a spare regulator in case one of the diver's regulator malfunctions. They should also take extra thermal undergarments, cold weather gear, and dive gloves and liners in case of a suit leak. Now, all divers should be able to disconnect the dry suit LP hose from the dry suit inflator valve with gloved or mittened hands. Otherwise, a dry suit inflator free flow in the water could result in an uncontrolled ascent. Remember that your dive buddy is there to help you as well. So, why is that such an important problem? If you get an overinflation on a dry suit, what do? You take your dry glove off and you open up the valve and you get the opportunity to let all the river into your dry suit. So at 32 to 33 degrees, opening up your dry suit and flowing that in is really not what you want to try. Now, one of the things I strongly encourage, and I can tell you, ice diving is absolutely a village sport. 7 days a week, twice on Sunday, high altitude and ice diving are a village sport. It's all about the team that's going to help you. But through this process, and any time you're getting into a higher pressure situation dive, you need to be able to actuate all your gear on your own. You need to be able to fully dress and undress yourself, to fully actuate, take a mask off, put a mask on, find your spare regulator. Is it clipped, ready to go? Can you get to it easily? Can you get your dry suit hose off? Can you get your inflator hose off? You need to be able to, with whatever you're wearing, you need to be able to actuate any of those pieces, disconnect an inflator hose, connect an inflator hose, disconnected inflator hose, and connected inflator hose. If you're diving twin sets, you need to be able to reach back and find the isolator. You need to be able to reach back and find the valves for either tank. Anything you dive, you need to be able to do all of the functions yourself by yourself. Now, with that said, diving as a village is a freaking awesome thing. Because that's a lot of heavy freaking gear. So just be aware. That's my biggest encouragement. Now, Brian, how could redundant equipment help you in high altitude diving before the dive?
So, I mean, really, if you're altitude diving, you're probably not in a big city. You know, if you're going to be somewhere remote, you know, it's kind of like having a save a dive kit. If something goes wrong, your pre-use checks and, oh, hey, you know, my regulator's busted. Well, instead of having to drive all the way back down and get something fixed, if you have a spare, like you said, a spelator, you know, a spare set of something to fix your equipment, then it could save your dive.
Absolutely. Two great examples of that. A few years ago, 3 years ago, I think it was, SSI sent out as part of the renewal kit, their professional level first and second stage. And I thought, okay. And I was teaching ice diving when I got it. And I thought, okay, this is their professional cold weather rated first and second stage. I'm going to go ahead and try it in ice diving. If it survives ice diving, it must be good to go. Now, I'm very happy I did take my other set with me that I normally ice dive with, but I can tell you, I got that all put together. I kicked that air on. I hopped in the water, and as soon as I hopped in the water and started my descent, took my first breath, it went straight into free flow. It absolutely happened. I've had free flow a few different times over the course. It absolutely happens. I popped out of the water. I took that regulator set off that was frozen solid, and put my other one back on it and went back to it. Now, interestingly enough, we have some friends in Alaska that from Dive Alaska, and they like to dive piston style first stages instead of diaphragmic, because their expression is where they dive, every regulator, no matter how good it is, will freeze. They like the piston style regulators because they're able to defrost them faster than the diaphragmic style. So, interesting enough, right gear, right place, right time. But absolutely, if you were diving with Dive Alaska, you've probably taken a helicopter somewhere and you're pretty far away from the village. And having a backup something is definitely to your advantage as well.
So I think that applies not just to regulators. I mean, you've talked a lot about regulators, but we've been in Yellowstone before, and both of us have either had a tear in a neck seal, a wrist seal, or a hole in our dry glove, and any one of those ends a dive. And for most of us, it's, well, we're gearing up on the surface, and you can still swap something out if you have it. But like the day that my neck seal tore, that was the only one we had, so I was done for the weekend.
That's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up, sweetheart. I can also tell you with dry suit diving, one of the greatest pieces of kit that you can add to any dry suit kit is super glue. I'm going to tell you right now, if you do not have a bottle of super glue in your Save a Dive kit for dry suit diving, you are missing out, dude. So, but just like Nikki said, extra seals, extra equipment, extra pieces of kit definitely go a long way. Making sure you've got the kit that you need to be able to accomplish your dive, or like what happened to Nikki, she was done for the weekend. I had a issue with my dry gloves on a dive not this season, but last season, where I had a hole in my dry glove that was literally about that big. It over the course of a 30-minute dive, I probably pulled in about 2 gallons of 31-degree water, 33-degree water. I absolutely got hypothermia. I was cold. I could not feel the left side of my body, and I could.
Somebody didn't want to call the dive because he didn't want to dive.
I got to the point during the dive with hypothermia that I was at 50 feet, and I couldn't do the math at what my ascent rate would be at 30 feet per minute, plus a 5-minute safety stop. I couldn't add those two together and figure out what my time to surface was. That's how far along. So you were a little bit of extra stuff. Now, I didn't have a spare pair of dry gloves with me that I could get to, or that were with me at all. But I had this hole. I got some super glue. I filled the hole with super glue. I let it dry overnight, and I actually dove that same pair of gloves for almost a year with a super glue patch. They did perfect. So a little bit of forethought goes a long way, especially when it comes to diving. Now, the other thing to be aware of is redundancy. Redundancy is a huge thing, especially when you start getting into high altitude diving and these more complex divings. The first thing you can do, you can add a Y valve or an H valve to a single cylinder. This is not my favorite, but it's at least something that allows that if you do have a first or second stage malfunction, you're able to go to the other first stage and turn off the one that's having the problem. This is a typical Y valve, and they haven't sold this style in a while. But here's an H valve, and this is basically built off of a twin set, open set valve kit. Now, this is two different ways, and this is so that you can go off of a single tank. Now, a more appropriate way is to add an additional cylinder. And the simple ways to do this is you can either strap one to your back. This is adding another cylinder. This is my least favorite way to go, adding a pony bottle strapped to your back, because it throws your balance off. The better way, in my opinion, is to add one in front of you. Now, Caleb, why do you think it would be better to have a pony bottle in front of you versus on your back? You're muted.
Sorry. There's the balance that you mentioned, but also access. If you're dealing with something, if you're strapped to your side or your front, you're going to be able to access it and deal with it in real time much easier.
Absolutely. Another piece about that as well is utilizing a pony cylinder. What you'll do is you'll charge it, check it, turn it, and then turn it off while it's charged. The nice thing with that is it will not have the ability to run out of gas on you. If it starts to bubble or has a problem, you'll be able to see it. You'll also have the ability that if you do need to use that as emergency gas and it starts free flowing, you can feather the cylinder as well. If it's on your back, you don't have that opportunity. There's also, Brian, that idea that if I have a pony bottle on me and you have an emergency, I can give you my pony bottle I can give you the actual entire cylinder. I don't have to just give you just the regulator and let you breathe off it where we're tethered together. I can actually say, here's the whole cylinder and clip it to you. And that way you're safe. We're not tethered together. We stay together as a buddy team, but you've got now redundant air that I can give you. So that's kind of the bonus and benefit of having it as an independent idea. Now, as you start moving up the line on this, other dynamics you can certainly do is I do dive twin sets a fair amount. It gives you two cylinders that can be isolated with one cylinder turned off. I've got my inflator for my BC hooked up to one side of the twin sets, and I've got the inflator for my dry suit hooked up to the other side. If something happens and I had a catastrophic gas loss on my left tank, and my left tank controlling my inflator for my BC, I still have an inflator hooked up to my dry suit, and my dry suit becomes a secondary inflation device. So that's the advantage of running twin sets, is I can absolutely isolate off one side or the other, and I can turn that tank off, but I still have an inflator hooked up to my dry suit and an inflator hooked up to my BC from separate sources. Now, you guys that know me well enough know that I prefer to dive something called side mount. And the great thing with side mount is that I have a minimum of two cylinders that are completely independent of each other, and the ability to switch back and forth. So if I have a catastrophic gas failure on one, I simply turn that tank off and go to the other tank. There's no reaching behind me. I can see what's going on, and it's easier to manipulate. But a little redundancy definitely goes a long way with this kind of stuff. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
All right. As we kind of continue down the process, the other thing we want to make sure is whatever air system we're using, for example, if we're using for our first and second stage, make sure you get one that is designed for extreme cold weather. Now, this is the uh, uh, MTXR from Apex. This is the step above what I use. And this one's designed for extreme cold weather. I use the XTX50 from Apex for all my cold water diving. It is solid and sealed, and it's designed for cold weather. And I've dove pretty darn cold, and I've never had a free flow. The XTX50 or MTXR is designed for extreme cold weather. So if I was spending a lot of time diving Antarctica, this would definitely be the set I would get. But make sure you take a look at that. Make sure that it's environmentally sealed. Make sure it's a diaphragmatic style regulator, so that you're able to dive safely without going into a free flow. Make sense?
Yep.
All right. Other things to be aware of is as you're diving with your dive computer, make sure that you're aware that does your dive computer set the altitude manually or automatically? In the case of the Suntos computers, for example, they are all manually set. They're set by a range. In the case of the Apex or the Shearwater or the Garmin, they are all set automatically, and they automatically come up with a compensation based upon the current altitude that you're at. They will add an algorithmic dynamic to your dives and shorten your bottom time based upon the current altitude that you're at. Make sense?
Yep.
Other considerations for diving at altitude are going to be visibility. As we all know, diving at altitude and lakes, a lot of times this is what your visibility looks like. It's not always wonderful like this. Take into consideration what your surface swim is going to be like. There are a lot of times where our surface swim is longer. In diving a lake where there's heavy wind, it works differently. The frequency and crest of the waves are much closer and much tougher to navigate than they would be in the ocean, where the waves are a lot farther apart. So as you start getting into that, be aware of the considerations. How far am I going to swim? What are the waves going to look like based upon the winds? And you can see here in this picture, that's Ryrie Reservoir during a pretty heavy, some heavy wind. By the way, that's Nikki down there. So be aware of that. Be aware of what the water temp's going to be, as well as entanglement hazards. As we know in Ryrie, there's lots of trees down there that we have to be aware of. Those trees happen to be wonderful because they catch all the fishermen's fishing line and lures. So it's definitely something to be aware of. There are going to be entanglement hazards. Make sure that as you're setting up your gear, that you have a knife and cutting device that you can reach with both hands and either hand. So I carry multiple cutting devices as you go through this process. Also be aware of that as you're diving these high altitudes, that maybe a knife isn't always the 100% most appropriate thing to carry. Sometimes scissors are more appropriate. Anybody ever try and cut a sharp treble hook with a knife?
Doesn't work.
I have. It doesn't work very well. No, I was caught up on a hook trying to save a sturgeon from a treble hook, and it got stuck on me, and I couldn't. And I had to try and use my knife, and I ended up using the knife to pry it out. But a pair of safety shears would have been a much more appropriate dynamic. So as you start thinking about where you're diving and how you're diving, you want to think about a few things. For example, what's the visibility? Where do I get in that's a safe entry? What are my environmental conditions? Is it snowing? Is it ice? I've got a wonderful video courtesy of Nikki that I was walking down the riverbank with my twin sets on, and I slid and fell right on my butt. Thank you, Nikki, for taking that video for me.
I wasn't trying to.
I know.
It just happened.
It just happened. But be aware, ice is slick. Be aware what the water conditions are, entanglement hazards, as well as current. What do you think? What are a couple of considerations, Brian, when it comes to current? Why would that be important?
So if you're trying to plan a dive, to go see, like say a certain part of a lake or a river, you can try and plan on getting in and having the current take you versus having to try and fight the current to go back to your point of getting out.
Absolutely.
Just the more work you're going to be, more work you're going to be doing, more air you're going to be using. Then also, if the current's strong in some places, maybe unless you absolutely can't.
Absolutely. What about safety stop or deco stops in a current in a river?
I don't know if I want to imagine that. It sounds difficult if you don't have a place to anchor yourself. So, I mean, that might be a consideration is, finding something to hold on to, or I don't know if they use like tethers or, anchoring lines when you do river, something where you can stay in one place, hold on to something.
Not usually. Not usually. A good example. I was doing a deco dive at Johns Hole Bridge earlier this year, and I'd built up 20 minutes of deco. I had plenty of gas. Gas was not the issue at all. I was running twin sets, and I had crap loads of gas for my 20 minutes of deco. I wasn't even going to get anywhere close to my bottom third, my reserve third. I got up to about 35 feet along the wall, and all of a sudden found a rogue up current, that started shooting me straight to the surface very quickly along a smoother wall. As I got to the 17-foot mark, I was able to reach out, and I found a small indention just big enough for 3 fingers of one hand to grab onto to keep me from shooting to the surface. Now, the problem is as you dive a dry suit and you go upside down in a current, what it does is it shoots all of the air in your dry suit to your feet. As the air in your dry suit is in your feet, it becomes very hard to bring your feet back down to get below you. So now you're head down, feet up, upward current that's trying to force you to the surface, and 3 feet into a small crevice hole. And by the way, I could see my computer. I was able to hold on to that for about 4 minutes, and watching the deco time click down, I'd gotten down to 17 minutes of deco left. Now, luckily, I was at 99% graded surface gradient factor, so I was still below 100% when I lost my grip and it shot me to the surface. I was able to back away from the wall and drop down to 25 feet and finish out my complete deco plus an extra 5 to 10 minutes of deco, and then I ended up doing a 4-minute safety stop to make sure I blew off all my nitrogen. But even this weekend, coming up from 95 feet in the river, I got to my 20 foot where I wanted to do my initial safety stop. It was very difficult because it was sand and biological. There was nothing to hold on to, and it was trying to force me downriver. So what I was having to do is put my face into the current and paddle during my safety stop instead of my normal just hang out. There was nothing to grab onto. There was nothing to lock into. I was closing in on my exit point, and so I had to continue to kick for my entire amount of my safety stop. Not a lot of fun. So be aware. A current is a big deal, and it affects more than just where you're positioning and getting in and getting out, but it also affects your safety stop and your deco stop. So deco diving in the river is a very much a big kid sport. You need to have experience. Now, interesting enough, I was talking to Nuno Gomez, who for many years had the deepest dive records in the world. And one of the things they talked about that I thought was most interesting was that as you build up experience, it's got to be current experience as well. You don't just go out and start doing big dives. You start with little dives, and then you add 10% at a time, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. And the same thing I talked to John Dalazuana, who was part of the hydrogen dive in New Zealand. And it turns out that cave that they did the hydrogen dive in, they've been diving for 17 years, and they've been expanding and going deeper in that cave every year, but they only add 10 to 20 meters at a time every season. They didn't go out and just suddenly do a 900-foot dive in this deep ass cave. They started at 500 feet. They got to 600 feet, then to 700 feet, then to 800 feet, and now they're at 900 feet in this cave. They didn't just suddenly. And the same thing, as you guys do this, don't go out and do the biggest dive you can possibly do. Build up and do littler dives until you have experience and you're comfortable with that. That will help you with your SAC rate as well, because as you build up experience with it, as experience builds calm, and calmness helps prevent emergencies. So be aware, current and river diving definitely has its challenges with cold, because there's really no thermoclimes in the river. The river that when I was diving Sunday was 31 degrees surface, 33 degrees at depth. It had a 2-degree change, whereas the lake right now will be probably 36 degrees surface, 42 degrees at depth. So just be aware, temperature, environmental conditions. When I was down diving the river on Sunday, there was plenty of fishing line down there. I probably could have strung up 2 or 3 fishing reels with all the fishing line that I found. So definitely making sure, and then safe entry. As you're going down these hills, ice and snow, I absolutely fell right on my butt. And here's a fun thing: when you're diving 100 pounds worth of twin sets, standing back up in twin sets is not your favorite thing. So, I think that's probably enough of that. Emergency procedures. Before you get into doing these big dives and wherever you're going, you want to make sure you know what the emergency, if something happens, what do you do? For example, where's the location of emergency services? Where's your O2 kit? Is there an AED close? How far away are you from a pressurization chamber, a hyperbaric chamber? Now, one of the things, and this may be overkill. Absolutely, I don't preclude the fact that this might be overkill, but Nikki and I have 2 bottles of oxygen in the back of our truck, and we have a fully charged AED. We tend to be a little bit more prepared. We also know that where there's chambers that we can get to very quickly. So be aware. What are the procedures of that as well? And then pre-plan what you're going to do. One of my favorite stories came from General Conference a number of years ago. And the story goes that they're back in the days when they had cabooses. I know Caleb and Brian, you guys don't know what a caboose is, but that's okay. There was a thing at the end of the train that they had an engineer and guide in that did stuff, right? Whatever he did, we still don't know, but he did some things that were important to a train. Well, one day this train was going through a mountain pass, and it was having some problems, and it was about to go off the rails, and everybody was going to die. The caboose conductor ended up walking forward through all this panic and mayhem, and he started flipping switches and doing specific actions in each car forward all the way back to his caboose, and he ended up saving the entire train. But he was very calm and collected through the whole process. And they asked him later, says, "Hey, what the heck? How did you do this? You were so calm, cool, and collected." He says, "Well, I've been riding this route for 40 years, and 40 years ago, I found out that this was a possibility that could happen. So what I did is I researched and found out what to do in this situation, and I made the decision 40 years ago that if this situation happened, I would do what I did." He pre-planned his actions. So pre-planning what to do in an emergency situation can absolutely positively save your life. Knowing where your knife is, knowing what to do, knowing how to act, that I'm going to stop, breathe, think, and act. So in an emergency situation, you need to regain control of yourself before you act. But the easiest way to do that is to know what you're going to do before you have to act. Think about the situations ahead of time. The best way to regain control is to control quickly is to immediately stop, calm down, take several breaths. Now, one of the things that happens in this deep diving that we're doing, you get down to 90 feet, you're getting to a high partial pressure of gas, but you're also getting to a high gas density. As this gas gets dense, we go back to the idea that it's not able to allow the carbon dioxide to be exhaled as easily. And when we start getting into hypercapnia, which is carbon dioxide buildup, what are some of the symptoms? What's one of the symptoms of hypercapnia, Brian?
Oh, I'm pretty sure it's like disorientation or getting dizzy.
Okay, disorientation, brain fog is one of them. Caleb?
Oh boy. Okay. Disorient.
Maybe anxiety?
Yeah, that's what I'm feeling right now.
Anxiety is absolutely one of them. Tom, what's another symptom, sign and symptom of hypercapnia?
Maybe like your motor skills.
Yeah, decreased motor skills, absolutely. And then finally, nausea. So absolutely. So if I'm at a deeper depth and I'm starting to build up some hypercapnia, whether I realize it or not, and a situation happens, I've got brain fog, reduced motor skills, anxiety. What's the best thing I can do if I'm getting anxious? Deep breaths.
That was one of the symptoms that I was going to say is shallow breathing.
Yeah, shallow breathing. So stopping, calming down, and taking several breaths. First, we're allowing ourselves the opportunity to review everything that's going on. Stop, breathe. As we're taking these deeper breaths, we're starting to off gas that carbon dioxide and reduce the signs and symptoms of hypercapnia that have become prevalent because of the high gas density. And because of that, we're able to get clearer thinking as well. So there's a science behind this. And this will relax you and make rational decisions more easy to make and prevent an irrational decision that might be dangerous. I was talking to Mike Young, who's the president and founder or president of Kiss Rebreathers. And he does these wild, amazing, crazy 900 feet dives on a rebreather through caves where he's squeezing through. And he was talking to me about a cave in Los Alamos, New Mexico, that he was diving where somebody actually lost their life. And he said there was 3 times during that dive that he felt that he was absolutely a goner. Pretty scary stuff. And I said, Mike, what did you do? What does that look like? And he says, here's what I do. He says, I stop, and he says, I relax, I take some breaths, and then I tell myself, I'm not making one more move until I know that that is the right move for me that will bring me closer to safety. He said, as he reads through these accident reports, he says there's always a point in the accident report that if they'd just done this one thing, they wouldn't have died. They didn't do that one thing. And he says, I stop and I try and figure out what that one thing is that will bring me that much closer to survival. So stop, breathe, think, act. Big breaths will definitely help. Make sense? Now, one of the most common and concerning things during high altitude diving is definitely aridity or dehydration. It's one of the biggest concerns. Now, be aware, the signs and symptoms of dehydration are dry mouth and tongue, feeling thirsty, dry mouth, urinating and sweating less than usual, dark colored urine, dry skin, feeling tired, and feeling dizzy. And now we're talking about
making me thirsty over here.
absolutely. That's why I keep my bottle of water that, yes, it does say go do dangerous shit. Absolutely. But story for another time. But make sure that you're staying well hydrated. It's one of the biggest concerns for high altitude diving and cold water. Other things to be aware of, we talked about cold water and hypothermia. Absolutely. Now, there is another one that this is a little bit lesser known and is becoming more prevalent and popular to study this and be aware of this in Europe. But it's slowly but surely moving its way to the America as well. It's IPO, Immersion Pulmonary Edema. Now, the causes of IPO, or immersion pulmonary edema, are when we are immersed in water, the hydrostatic pressure causes compression in the leg veins. And as a result, the blood that normally pools in legs is pushed centrally into the chest. The increased central blood volume increases the pressure in the alveoli capillaries and causes fluid to leak into the lungs and causes difficulty breathing, and if not corrected, can cause death. It has been known for some time that high blood pressure carries increased risk of pulmonary edema, which is why it forms one of the screening questions in diving medical form. What was previously less understood is that very strenuous exercise could also trigger IPO. This had previously been reported by military divers under extreme training. That current levels of extreme exercise might arise in diving, for example, when attempting to rescue another diver or fighting a current. Now, we've talked about this to ad nauseum, that high altitude diving requires a lot more equipment, causing a lot more strain, which can cause immersion pulmonary edema. Now, avoidance of IPO is the result of combination of immersion in water and the body's responses to that immersion. Other than avoiding entering the water in the first place, some simple steps that may help reduce the risk are if you're hypertensive, high blood pressure can contribute to the risk. Divers with high blood pressure should seek specialist advice from a medical referee. Hydration. Divers should not drink excessive fluids prior to dive. Be properly hydrated. And exercise. Extreme levels of exercise can contribute to IPO, even if a fit individual. And so, when possible, minimize the need for extreme exercise prior to any dives. Now, here's where how it was discovered. In 2017, this is how new this is. In a quarry in England, there was a dive instructor that had another instructor with him, and they were doing a dive with a slightly overweight student. And they were doing a deep dive class, and they were all diving twin sets. The dive was roughly 150 meters, so a fairly strenuous swim. When they got to the point where they were ready to do their descent to the 120 feet that they were going to be diving, the diver complained that he was having a hard time catching his breath and breathing. So they allowed him time to calm down and to breathe. They descended to site, and they got and did their dive for 10 to 15 minutes. As they began their ascent, the diver complained that he was out of gas. Remember, the diving twin sets at 120 feet for 10 minutes. So the instructor did exactly what he was supposed to do, and he had the other instructor share air with him. At the 60-foot mark, the diver complained again that he was out of gas, but he was air sharing with the other instructor who was diving twin sets and who was not having a problem. At 20 feet, the primary instructor began to air share with the student. The student again complained of the lack of ability of air, and that he was running out of gas, and attempted to make a bolt to the surface. The instructor, at this point, feeling since they'd done a deep dive, held this student in place for 2 more minutes to finish up the safety stop. Once they got to the surface, the diver complained of not being able to breathe and passed out. They drugged the diver to the shore, giving rescue breaths as they progressed, and beginning CPR, calling for first aid and an ambulance. That unfortunately the diver died of conditions. When they pulled him up, and did the autopsy, they determined that he had drowned. Upon further investigation, they determined that the diver had actually suffered an internal drowning, which was an immersion pulmonary edema. Contributing factors to this, they found out that he had high blood pressure, was on medication, and on his medical screening had expressed that he did not have high blood pressure. In further investigation, they determined he had checked off the box of not having high blood pressure because he was medicated for it. So just because you're taking pills for something doesn't mean you don't have the something. Be honest on your medical form. So immersion pulmonary edema is basically an internal drowning where the alveoli in the lung structure causes you to causes them to create liquid, and fills the lungs with liquid, causing the diver to literally internally drown. Signs and symptoms of it: diver with breathing difficulties, not exercising particularly strenuously. Breathing difficulties may be indicated by rapid, uneven, or heavy breathing and coughing uncontrollably. Confusion, swimming in the wrong direction or random directions. Inability to carry out normal functions, whilst appearing to have concentrated on and to appear to concentrate on breathing. Belief that a regulator is not working properly. Indication of out of gas when the regulators are found to be working correctly or adequate gas supply. Diver refusing or rejecting an alternative source when out of gas. Indication of difficulty breathing when on the surface. Treatment for it. Sit them upright if they're conscious. Give them oxygen. Keep them warm. And do not give fluids. It is essential that medical advice be sought immediately. IPO is a serious thing.
So in that situation you talked about, did the instructors do anything wrong, or was it mostly just kind of on the fault of the student diver for not divulging his medical history?
Initially, the court, they took him to court, and he was initially found to be guilty because he wouldn't allow his student to immediately ascend when he tried to bolt to the surface, and he held him down for the safety stop. But on further investigation, he was found to be innocent. Unfortunately, that instructor has never dove again. So, being all right. You guys ready for the final exam?
Sure.
All right. All right. We'll go round robin. Tom, you're first. What is the minimum altitude to be considered an altitude diver?
1,000 feet.
1,000 feet is exactly right. Ding, ding, ding. All right. Caleb, what is the maximum recommended altitude for altitude diving?
10,000 feet.
10,000 feet is exactly right. Ding, ding, ding. All right. Brian, there are several contributing factors to decompression illness. Which one is the greatest concern for altitude diving? Nitrox, alcohol consumption, proper rest, or dehydration?
For altitude, probably would say decompression illness. Yeah, I was gonna say dehydration. I mean, I feel like nitrox use might get in there too, but I feel like dehydration is probably a little bit of a bigger concern.
Yep, that's that's one of the biggest concerns because it's very easy to get dehydrated at altitude. All right, back to Tom. You can identify high altitude dives sites by the presence of mountainous terrain. True or false?
False.
Correct. All right, Caleb. At sea level, flexible gas-filled container is submerged to 33 feet fresh water at the depth. It has a volume of 1 cubic feet. Will the volume container be if it is brought directly to the surface?
2 cubic feet.
That's exactly right. Brian, container from question 5 is brought to the surface, but at an altitude of 3,000 feet, what will the volume of the container be when it reaches the surface?
D, 2.21 cubic feet.
Exactly. Tom, from the SSI altitude pressure variation table, what is the atmospheric pressure at 4,000 feet?
0.864 atmospheres.
Exactly. All right, Caleb, most common dive tables rely on a minimum hydrostatic cap of what at the surface?
1 atmosphere.
Is exactly right. Brian, a diver plans a dive at 4,000 feet to 70 feet fresh water. What is the sea level equivalent depth, the sled?
So that should be C, 80 feet freshwater.
Yep, I think you already had that question too, if I remember right. Tom, what advantages does a valve with a separate outlet provide for an altitude diver?
Redundancy.
Redundancy is exactly right. Caleb, what is the preferred method of preventing hypothermia when altitude diving?
Using a dry suit.
You're using a dry suit. I think you've got a desire for that at some point. All right.
Right now I'm on the hot water bottle technique.
Exactly. Brian, safety stop depth
Not working so well.
No, it doesn't. Safety stop depth should be adjusted as you ascend in altitude. True or false?
That is true.
Brian?
True.
Good job. All right. A number of water skills are vital to managing risk on every dive, Tom. Which of the following skills is most critical for altitude diving?
Ascent rate control.
Yep. A diver completes And Caleb, a diver completes a dive to a sled of 60 feet for 45 minutes. What is the minimum surface interval time before ascending 4,000 feet in altitude to become an A group diver?
Ooh.
And I don't remember going over the slide, to be honest with you. So it's 2 hours for every 1,000 feet.
2 hours for
every
every
1,000 feet
1,000
of
feet.
ascent.
Okay, so that would be 8 hours.
Yes. And I don't, for some reason, I don't remember seeing this slide. I know I have the slide in there. I don't remember seeing the slide. So, guys, as you ascend, the easiest way to figure out surface interval for ascending is 2 hours for every 1,000 feet of gain. So, if you're going to ascend 4,000 feet, that's 8 hours.
That makes sense.
All right. Brian, a diver completes travel from a location that is 5,000 feet above his home location for a dive. What letter group for residual nitrogen would the diver need to start with to account for the elevation difference? 5,000 feet.
So 5,000 feet of BC. Yeah, so that should be an F group diver.
That's exactly right. All right. Tom, a diver completes travel from a location that is 3,000 feet above his home location for a dive. How long would he need to wait prior to diving to become an A group diver?
Well, you just said it's 2 hours for every 1,000 rule
Yep.
of thumb. So how about 5 hours and 49 minutes?
5 hours and 49 minutes is exactly right. So as you can see, my 2 hours adds a little bit of a safety margin, but not by a ton. All right, Caleb, a diver who is diving at altitude can make repetitive dives of the same dive. True or false?
True, but should add some extra time.
Absolutely. All right, congratulations. That is the end of altitude diving. Notes for this, residual nitrogen prior to dive. These are the notes that I will send you guys as well. There you go.
Cool.
What questions do you have? We went through a lot of information, guys. We took this a little deeper than I probably normally go, but that's okay. I'd rather go a little deeper than too shallow, right?
Really,
I've got a question for you if you have time.
I have time.
A lot of times when I'm diving and my computer will give me a low PO2 warning.
Mhm.
So I talked to Shearwater and they said that like the factory settings 0.19 and they recommended at altitude to go to 0.17 for your atmospheres.
Mhm.
What is going on there when I'm getting that low PO2? Why?
That's a great question. And so what's happening is you're at a lower partial pressure of oxygen because you're at a higher altitude. And since you're at a higher altitude, for example, where I'm sitting right now, where it's 80.85, that literally means that we're 85% of the normal amount of oxygen. So if we're used to 21% oxygen, literally we're breathing 0.21 times 0.85. So right now where I'm breathing, we're breathing 18% oxygen where I'm sitting right now. The equivalent, because we're at a lower partial pressure or higher atmosphere, lower partial pressure. So we're breathing equivalent of 18%. So that's one of the things as we go up at higher in altitude, there's less oxygen. It's because we have a lower partial pressure of oxygen that we're breathing. So typically, I'll be honest with you, Tom, I set the alarm on mine to 0.16.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yep, and that way I don't get the partial pressure alarm. I still get on the Shearwater, the partial pressure of oxygen still gives me the yellow mark when it's at 0.18 or 0.17. But I don't set the alarm till 0.16.
Okay.
I also do the same thing on the Apex and the Sunto. I've got the partial pressure alarm set to 0.16.
But it's still
Okay.
comes up with a low PO2 for you to have to clear.
Well, it doesn't give me the alarm anymore, unless I get below 0.16, which we get that when we go to Yellowstone. We're going below 0.16. We're at 0.15, so we're still getting the cleared alarm, but you have to be aware because we're at the higher altitude. We're breathing a lower partial pressure of oxygen because of that.
Okay. Thank you for that.
No, absolutely, that's a good question.
So I'm curious then, because isn't Tom the gentleman that sent you the questions or talked to you about diving at the 14,000 feet or whatever in Colorado?
10,600, yes.
So if you increase that over the 10,000 feet, do you need to then continue to adjust the PPO2 down to then be able to change that limit?
Yeah, he's at 10,000 feet. If he's at 0.16, he's still absolutely going to get a PPO2 alarm. So the PPO2 at 10,000 feet is going to be 3.5 times 35. So 0.58 divided by 1. 1 divided by 0.58 equals. So literally, he's going to be. Oh man. Times 0.6. So you're going to at 10,000 at your 10,000 feet, you're going to be at about 12% oxygen, 11 to 12% oxygen in that area, depending upon the atmospheric pressure. So to not get the alarm, you're going to have to set your PPO2 alarm to 12%, right? Which is crazy.
Well, isn't that where you started like talking about like a normoxic or hypoxic
Yeah,
treatment?
at that point that you're getting into hypoxic nature because you're such a high altitude. So you're getting into a hypoxic idea. Yeah, so you got a lot of nitrogen and a little bit a low amount of oxygen. So you're definitely at a more challenging environment because you're hitting absolutely the extreme.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just needed a understanding of what that alarm was, if I needed to, when I need to be concerned, and so.
Oh, great question. Great question.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What other questions do we have, guys?
I guess would kind of be the opposite of altitude diving, but there's a couple places around the world where you're actually below sea level. Would those equations still work for that, or would it just make more sense to go conservative with what you have at sea level?
I don't know about you, but what I've seen of the Dead Sea, I don't want to dive there. It was worse than the shore at Ryrie, but maybe there's spots in the Dead Sea that are clear.
So you'd be diving shallower than what you think you are, but you got to remember that with altitude diving, the first point where you consider altitude diving is over 1,000 feet. Is there a place on Earth that you can dive that's below 1,000 feet of sea level?
The only one I know of is the Dead Sea. There might be one more because I think at some point at the Dead Sea is like 1,100 feet below sea level. I think that's what I saw. Maybe that was the overall depth.
Let's go try to dive it.
Yeah, it's 1,400 feet below sea level. You're right. I'm not sure if I've ever heard of any diving the Dead Sea before. It's because of its extreme high content, but you'd be diving shallower than what you.
Crazy! Like, how much extra lead would you have to wear in the Dead Sea because of the salt content?
Yeah, because of the high salt content, it's definitely an issue as well. There's definitely places that have such high salt content that you have to deal with that as well. But that's interesting. I don't know, to be honest with you. By theoretical atmospheric pressures, you'd be diving shallower than what you think instead of deeper. So if you were diving 10 feet, it'd be the equivalent of diving 8 feet. So it wouldn't be a huge amount.
Yeah, again,
it's a good question. I haven't had to. Sure. That's a good question. What other questions? Caleb, I know you got a question or two.
You might have just done too good a job teaching the class.
I try to teach a very thorough class, that's for sure.
Hey, Ben, I've got one.
Sure.
Caleb wants to think about it. So I emailed you about narcosis at altitude, and I'm just trying to understand, like, to me, my little brain, you've got less atmospheric pressure at altitude.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think, say you're 100 feet at 10,000 feet of altitude, you've got less atmospheric pressure. So I would think that your levels of narcosis would be less.
So by pure theory, yes, and this goes into the same idea of gas density. That narcosis is based upon the density and the partial pressure. Now, remember, if we're at that level and we've acclimatized to that level, then narcosis, theoretically, based upon acclimatization, would be the sled depth. And it's my belief that you should always work with a sled depth because at worst, it'll give you an additional safety margin.
Okay.
At
But then,
best,
okay,
you
go
can
ahead.
go by actual depth.
Okay. So you had talked earlier in the class about like some of this stuff was based on not being acclimatized yet. And
Yes.
so I could see that, running the sled depths for, when you're thinking about narcosis levels because you're not acclimatized. I could see that messing with you. But yeah, I was just trying to wrap my brain around it still.
So with altitude, I use all sled depths for everything, for gas consumption, for narcosis, and gas density, based upon acclimatization. Now, in truth, in true physics, the only thing that sled depth affects is decompression times.
Okay.
So in true physics, but when we take into the account the body physiology as well, I add in the sled depths to all of it. And at the very worst, it gives you the idea that you get a higher safety margin on all of that. At worst, you've just added a 30% safety margin or 20% or 40% safety margin. So,
Okay. All right, cool.
so there's a debate on that. I've actually got an interview on Friday with a pretty well-known physiologist that he's one of the researchers that discovered the issues with gas density. So it's part of some of the questions I will be asking him just to clarify for my own, just to what his thoughts on it are. So
Cool.
I will be asking those. Absolutely. Other questions, Brian? You got any questions?
Nope, I think you covered them all.
Awesome. All right. Well, tomorrow morning I'll be sending out a DocuSign document. Caleb, you've already got yours because I was trying to get yours ahead of time. You make sure you hurry and get that to me because I want to get yours for your assistant instructor and this done at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, by the way.